visited 2 farmers markets, Curbside Farmers Market and Piedmont Triad Farmers Market. And we interviewed local farmers and made a commercial for the farmers market. And then we met Chef Sean at A.C.E.S downtown, and he talked about only using locally grown produce and meats and how important it is to support local farms. We traveled to the Outer Garden Project and spent the day putting together food bags for families in need. And by the end of the 2 weeks, I visited all of these places I never even knew existed. And they're right here in Greensboro. And they are caring about the same problems I care about and actively working on them. During that second week of class, I actually got joining the green team, and Dr. Hayes suddenly invited me on a trip to Chicago to the Afrofuturism and Climate Change Conference that our green team enthusiast, Angel's sister, Aaliyah Collins, designed especially for us. And we went, and I got to spend 4 days with these incredible farmers and social justice activists working to change their community in Chicago's South Side. We visited 5 urban farms, met the farmers, and I felt like I was at home. That's what today is about, changing our thinking around sustainability. Bennett College needs to know about growing our own food, about community environmental justice advocates in Greensboro and North Carolina, about global climate change, and we can start now by changing our habits, because this affects all of us, especially us as Black women. We can also make a difference as a women's college if we choose to do so. We have a great event for you all today. Dr. Monica White, author of Freedom Farmers and Distinguished Chair of Integrated Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is here today to give our keynote. But first, I would like to invite our Green Team seniors to the stage for our seniors panel led by the Green Team President, Davey Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, seniors. I would just like us to start with our introduction. Tell us where you're from, your major, and why you're here in Michigan. I'm Bailey, I'm from Michigan, and my experience here on the Green Team, I joined just like Biani through a class, and I want to hear how you guys got started.
Hello everyone, my name is Mahaya Burley. I am a senior biology major from Syracuse, New York.
And why you got
Everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Great.
Nevaeh Burley. So, Nevaeh, I want to start with you and ask you personally, what do you feel like was most impactful for the Green Team, and what experience do you think what made it so successful for the Green Team?
So first in 2021, we start implementing blue recycling bins to everyone's stores, and we also have big blue bins that's on every home in our residence hall. That was a big impact for me because before 2021, Bennett College was without recycling for 10 years. So basically that was our stepping stone of how we can start implementing recycling on campus and within our community as well. So that was one of my most impacts. And another thoughtful thing that I liked a lot was one of our clothing squads that we had on campus. Most of our sister bells, we implemented changing clothes and giving back clothes so people won't have their clothes go to waste and stuff like that. So those was one of my groundbreaking impacts of our team.
One of my biggest impacts that we brought on campus was when we took, because we use all styrofoam in the cab, so it was like we went from using styrofoam to now using regular plates and regular forks, and so that was a big impact for me because it reduced waste. And, styrofoam is not biodegradable, and it doesn't break down, so that was really big because it was reducing waste, and also it was cool to see like our workers actually like something that we thought of. It was actually cool to see like, oh, now people are actually using this, and it's cool to see like something that was actually becoming. So yeah.
An impactful thing that we did on the Green Team, mine should be a bit more internal. When we went to Chicago for the Afrofuturism and Climate Change conference, I am from Chicago, Illinois, but I have not known about like the greenery and things that people are doing to like make the city more sustainable and make the city more like beautiful. So it was nice to see what efforts were done on farms and stuff like that, to see what kind of stuff was being grown right in the city where I grew up.
The most impactful thing that we did as a Green Team for me was planting seeds in the raised garden beds that we had. I thought it was really cool to be able to see something that I partake in kind of grow and come to life. So now if you look at the garden, it's very lively. So.
I would say my most impactful event that we did as a Green Team was the herbal tea party we hosted at the end of December. Well, at the end of November. The idea was to collect all the herbs that we could find in our garden, dry it out, and have a tea party. And so we picked the herbs and we put it on the racks in our greenhouse, and we dried them out. And we brought the peppermint tea, the lemon balm tea out to the GLC so everyone could try it. And we experimented and did, I'm telling the whole story. We experimented and did the peppermint tea, freshly picked from the garden, and the peppermint tea that we had got from the cafeteria. And we noticed that the peppermint tea that was freshly picked was very rich, and the peppermint tea from the cafeteria had an artificial taste. And having that experience lets me know that eating food fresh from the garden has an impact on my mental health, on my well-being, and how I connect with my food. And so that was one of my favorite moments.
To add into that, I would say I think a lot of us in here joined in on the tree planting ceremony this past fall. Greensboro Beautiful, they allowed us to plant 198 trees, just at 200 trees. And it was an experience not only as us for Bells, later on they'll see like, oh, we started the Green Team, but they won't really know us, but they'll see trees across the campus. And us as Bells and alum that did that, that's something that really sets our mark here on the campus, and they'll be here years and years after all of us are gone. So just, adding beauty to Greensboro because we are a community. So we just want to, be able to share with our community and let everyone know that what we do does make an impact. So doing that as well as with like, the past members of the green team and my grandmother who came and like putting the pearls in, some of them weren't quite very good, but like, this one little pearl is okay. We put pearls in the, as we planted in the ground. That's like something that I'll be like, oh yeah, we did that. So years from now, I think that that's one of the most impactful things that I felt was great with the green team. But last question, starting with you, Biani. We're graduating in May. What lessons from the green team will you carry into your life that you've learned with us?
That's a good question. I would say that being sustainable is easy, and it is a practice and a lifestyle. So the more you're involved in sustainability, whether it's gardening or changing the way that you eat or practicing recycling, make it fun, make it creative, and you're doing your part. That's all you have to do. Just try, and it will become easier and easier and more fun for you to do.
I think the biggest takeaway I've been able to grasp from the green team was really just taking initiative. All of the things that we talked about, our experiences that we've had from the green team, it really just started from a couple of girls that had a vision that they wanted to see come to life. And so, I would just say take an initiative. If you see something, want it, go after it.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is I will take my kind of newfound leadership qualities from my time on the team because I kind of joined in more of like a supportive role. Like I was just ready to support everybody, I wasn't trying to, take the lead, but I think that Dr. Grace pushes you to, take something and make it your own. Like with the assignments that we have and everything we do.
I think I would take away the green team is just learning how to like advocate for others, and I would take that as me because I feel like on the green team, we like advocate for schools in ways like how we brought like they talk about we brought recycling and how like we brought like the campus garden here, and I feel like those are like resources and just advocating for things that the school may need and just advocating just for the world and the planet in general. So I think that's something that I would take and just learning to speak out for like people who just be good persons.
One thing I would take away from the green team or meeting in May is being persistent and also advocating for our sisters, but not only our sisters, our community as well. Since I've been on the green team, we've made a big change on our campus for the last 4 years now. And I think that since we are stepping that stepping stone, we are also leaving a legacy not only for us, but for our sister girls to continue what we've been doing on campus. So just be persistent and also lead that way for the others as well.
To close off the panel, I'd just like to say, excuse me, I've learned that any small thing matters. Just having like a small vision. Nevaeh was one of the founding members, and they had a small vision. They never knew like the impact they would make on campus. They just knew they wanted to do something. And faith without works is dead. So as long as you have, just the tiniest dream, you never know who you're going to impact. And I just feel like I've been encouraged to always go for what I feel like is right. You never know who's watching you. We just had 2 Aggies come in today, and they are planning on starting a garden over at A.C.E.S. So you never know like what connections or who you would be inspiring to do something. So always do what you feel is right and do whatever that is. So now that you've heard a little bit about what we've done, we kind of want you to see what we've done. So after a small video, we'll have our founding member Nevaeh introduce our speaker. Thank you.
positioning agriculture as a tool for resistance and resilience. An Andrew Partridge Fellow, Dr. White is also directs the HBCU project and initiative. An initiative dedicated to advancing agroecology at historically black colleges and universities. Her work has garnered prestigious research grants and teaching awards, underscoring her influence in the field. Dr. White also wrote a book titled Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement. I was also excited to hear that Dr. White's mother is from Eden, North Carolina, also from the being of Bennett. We are thrilled to have you here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Monica White.
Thank you, Nevaeh. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor, a privilege. I'm truly grateful. As Nevaeh shared with you, growing up, my mother left Eden, North Carolina at 16 to start college in Detroit. And the only college I ever heard of was Bennett. It would have been her dream. She said she wished she could have been a Bennett Belle. And so there's a part of me that knows that she is happy that I'm here, welcomed by you, warmed by you. I feel like I'm with family. I love this picture because if you remember Bill Withers' song, Grandma's Hands, growing up in the South, we would travel from Detroit to either Mobile, Alabama, where my father was from, or Eden, North Carolina, where my mom's, we still have family land. And one of the traditional experiences is to shuck peas. And it was a moment and an opportunity for us to sit with our elders and to participate in this food tradition. And so it is my hope that some of the words that I share with you are encouraging for our graduating seniors, congratulations, for our young babies like Miss Alexandria that I just met, and honors the legacy and the work of our elders and our ancestors. So I thank Ms. Tanya Sistrunk and Dr. Ann Hayes for the invitation, and Rolisa Tutwiler for the logistics and making the arrangements for my travel. So since I am always one to start with my own roots, this is my granddaddy Kenneth and my grandma Pearl from Eden, North Carolina. Granddaddy Kenneth was a farmer, and Grandma Pearl was also a farmer. And so we would come down in the summers, and in the front of the house, they had a store. And so in the summer, you know, my mom would say, oh, don't feed that child all that candy, all that gum. And like any good grandparent, guess what they do? All the candy, all the gum. But it's really interesting, you know, life has a funny way of showing you who you are. And so here's a picture of my granddaddy Kenneth in the store. It wasn't until my mother had fallen ill and I was in conversation with my aunt, and I said, Aunt Barbara, can you tell me about that store that was in the front of the house at Grandma Pearl's and Granddaddy Kenneth's house? She said, oh yes, baby, it was a co-op. I had already written the book, Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance, about black agricultural cooperatives. I knew my granddaddy was a farmer, but I didn't know he started a co-op. And this store was called the Community Store. So here Granddaddy Kenneth is sitting in front of the community store. They said most people wanted to wait until he was gone because he was mean and a penny pincher. They love working with my Grandma Pearl. But it's just one of those things where you never know how following your passion and following your story allows you to unearth a legacy and a richness, not only for the culture, but also connecting you to your own life's mission. One of my favorite people before and after is George Washington Carver, who said there's probably no subject more important than the study of food. So the work of George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, Watley, were the founders of our agroecological motto. What we find in a lot of the history books is that there's a muted role of black farmers. And so it's important for us to unearth those narratives, those stories, by reaching back so that we have something important to offer to Ms. Alexandria. And so I wanted to make sure that the work that I did unearthed those stories, but also offered a different lens by which we can understand the role of black farmers, but the role of black farmers, not just in the Black freedom movement, but especially in the civil rights movement. Just a few of the publications that we've been able to publish. I'll be talking a lot about Mrs. Hamer today, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Freedom Farm Agricultural Cooperative. But we published a piece, A Pig in a Garden. The book that we mentioned, Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement. I wrote a piece during COVID on the origins of black food justice that really sort of centered on the role of black organizations in cities as they created strategies to make sure that folks had access to nutrient-rich foods. And in the book, Black Food, I wrote a piece, Feeding Ourselves in Dangerous Times, Lessons of Love, Food, and Freedom Farmers, where I created the image of what would happen if Mrs. Hamer, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, Mrs. Shirley Sherrod, who is a legendary food justice farmer and activist who's still with us, and of the future of those movements and what lessons they have to learn. And I just recently published a piece, Agriculture and Academics, The Golden Door of Freedom, that I'll talk a bit about. So what I know about, before any research is done, you kind of got to go and see what is the narrative? What are we talking about? What do we know? And what I found was that there was what I call the danger of a single story. When you have a danger of a single story, it leads people to believe we already know what we need to know. But in talking about the importance of black farmers, I realized that there was a danger, and that story, that narrative was that black farmers, if ever included, were seen as passive. Things happened to them, they were not agents. And it also focused on a deficit frame, talking about aging farmers and black land loss. But I knew there had to be something more, because if we look historically, every economic downturn, black folks have turned to the land, period. So if that's the case, the narrative can't be a deficit model. So what asset-based approach can we take to understanding what black farmers have done, what contributions that makes to building healthy, whole communities? And so that was the story I was looking to find. So my research questions for this particular project were really, what were the contributions of black farmers to the Black freedom and civil rights movement? And how does agriculture expand our understanding of a resistance strategy? When we think about resistance strategies, we know for sure marches, boycotts, and protests. And those are important, period. They are very, very important. But what are some of the resistance strategies that are defined by those who engage in them that fall behind the radar? And what I mean by that is when you think about protests, marches, and boycotts, our energy is toward those that we envision are standing between us and freedom. What happens when we engage in resistance strategies that are really us diverting our attention and our efforts to building the kind of reality that we want to see? And I argue that agriculture is that, and the work of Mrs. Hamer really demonstrates that in beautiful ways. So my research process was elaborate. I started in Detroit, 313, what up, though? That's my hometown. And the folks in Detroit were transforming community spaces into community growing spaces, community health centers, and places for distributing healthy and nutrient-rich foods. So it was with the Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network that I really learned about the language of food sovereignty and food justice well beyond my PhD. I wanted to also offer a lens and a mirror to the decades, centuries of black folks who have toiled the soil to feed their families and others. And so I really wanted to understand and offer a different lens of the history of agriculture. So you can't talk about agriculture without talking about Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. And W.E.B. Du Bois really does have something to say in this conversation. I call them the three wise men, but they needed a sister to show them how to do it. Mrs. Hamer, right? And so what I would do is that during the data collection process, I would be in the archives during the day, and it's so emotional. It's a lot going on. You have to be on it. You have to be fresh. You have to make sure you see everything. And then at night, I would find local black farmers that I could go hang out with and ask some questions. Well, I saw this in the archives. Can you help me understand this? Because all of my research has to be rooted in community, and it has to represent those about whom I'm speaking. And so that was really super important. So where did I go? I was in the Mississippi Department of History, the Amistad Collection at Tulane, the Wisconsin Historical Society, Tuskegee University, Birmingham Public Library, Alabama State Archives, the Schomburg Center for Research, and the Walter Reuther Archives. So when we talk about the lens through which we understand black farmers, we know that Booker T. Washington, while having a very complicated history, I'll admit, I had to do a lot of work to understand his role in black agriculture. Some days we just went at it. I was like, look, I appreciate you, but dang, you make it hard. So I really wanted to look at his work through a different lens. And what I found was that as an institution, students traveled to Tuskegee. Their parents were farmers. They sent them there to school. Then they returned to those home communities. And in those home communities, they established Tuskegee-like institutions that were also educational institutions. And there was an argument, like back in the 70s, that over 1 million black farmers had been supported by the work of Booker T. Washington. So I feel like his legacy needs to be a little bit more complicated than what we think we know. Here's Du Bois, and the reality that he's more than an argument, right? Most people just sort of reduce them to a debate and argument, but I think there's so much more. Du Bois argued that the understanding of cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, economic cooperatives, was really the strategy. He said it was the best contribution of his life's research, but also that it is the pathway for our freedom. George Washington Carver, whose life, just has not fully been understood. We know a lot about him in terms of conservation, but not nearly as much about his role in sustainable agriculture. And Sister Fannie Lou, who we'll be talking about a bit more. So I'll just go quickly because I don't want to run out of time. When we think about agriculture, think about this comment from black farmer Benjamin Carr. The reason I always wanted to be a farmer is because I believe then and I believe now that the farmer is the only free man we have in our race. So farming for him was freedom, and this was in 1914. And so the research that I developed has really led me to think about what is agricultural resistance. Now, if you go to the USDA, agricultural resistance may be related to the kinds of pesticides that they use, the herbicides, and how we're coming up with these super weeds. That's not my definition. So what I mean when I say agricultural resistance is food production and the development of community-based food systems as an opportunity to transform our food options, neighborhoods, our lives, and the world. The ways that communities use food production as a strategy of community self-determination, self-reliance, and as a way to build. So let's talk about Mrs. Hamer. I feel like it's such an important conversation because when I first started this research, I was heartbroken. This had to be maybe 2010, 2012. When I first started this research, people would say, well, what are you working on? And I would say, Mrs. Hamer. And they would say, who? My gabbers were flat. What are y'all kids with the gabbers were flat? No, they flip it, right? Y'all, I was flabbergasted, but y'all say something different. Anyway, I'm trying to be cute, and that ain't work. Okay, never mind, but y'all get my point. I couldn't believe it. Like somebody who lived their lives for our freedom and our right to vote had been erased to a memory. So it was through this work that I believe gained a lot of momentum in understanding and remembering who she was. Mrs. Hamer was a 20th child of sharecroppers. She was full-time in the feed at the age of 6. By the age of 13, she was able to pick 200 to 300 pounds of cotton a day. She had polio and was involuntarily sterilized. She called it the Mississippi appendectomy. She registered to vote and was fired and evicted. She was brutally beaten for her attempts to register. She was a field organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the founding member of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and offered a testimony at the Credentials Committee. And so this is a picture, right, of her in this historic moment. I think it was Eisenhower who was so afraid of what she was doing that they, cut the camera feed off of her. But her story, her message resonated, and people still heard what she had to say about what it meant to vote in the South. But after she reflected on what happened, she said, they kicked me off the plantation, they set me free. It's the best thing that could happen. Now I can work for my people. So when we think about food and food justice, we think about food as resistance. We don't often think about food and access to nutrient-rich food as a strategy of oppression. And so this is what I call her the organic intellectual. She said, down in Mississippi, they are killing Negroes of all ages on the installment plan through starvation. If a Negro goes to vote, if you persist in dreams of black power, I'm sorry about the typos, to win some measure of freedom in white-controlled counties, you go hungry. There is a way to fight against this nonviolent weapon of white officialdom. Where a couple of years ago, white people were shooting Negroes trying to register. Now they say, go ahead and register, then you'll starve. And so for her, seeing food as a strategy of oppression, she turned to food as a strategy of resistance and did some amazing things. What did she do? Well, she created a community garden. And that community garden, that growing space, folks worked in the garden, and 10% went into this market, this farmer's market. And this is Mrs. Hamer in the hat and coat. This is at the Freedom Farm Agricultural Cooperative in 1969. And the goal was to provide food and economic independence to local people in Ruleville, Mississippi. In addition to food production, they also had a sewing cooperative and a leather cooperative. Interestingly enough, it's not enough that I was writing about my grandfather and his friends who started the co-op, and didn't realize that until after I had written the book. But to find that so much of what she had done in Ruleville, Mississippi was actually offered in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I live now. So there was an organization, Measure for Measure, that supported Mrs. Hamer and those initiatives. So there was leather work, leather smithing, and also sewing cooperative. This is a picture of the pig bank. Now, the pig bank was interesting because for them, it offered economic autonomy in some ways. A family would get pigs, baby pigs, and they would raise them and feed them. And the pigs would then serve as food or supplemental income. They were called the sunflower pigs. They were treated as celebrities. So once your pig had piglets, those piglets would go back into the farm, and they were able to really feed a lot of families by using everything related to the pig, as we would say, from the rooter to the tutor. They had this was a co-op in every kind of way, right? They had a tool bank, they had a farm manager, they believed in subsistence crops, and cash crops were used to pay the mortgage. They had contracts with companies like Atkins Pickles and Heinz Ketchup. And housing was so critical because a lot of folks who registered to vote were fired from their jobs and evicted from their homes. And so Mrs. Hamer believed you shouldn't be penalized for your right to participate in political power. So these were some of the homes that folks lived in before. Here are some of the I'm blanking on the word. Blueprints, thank you. Yes, thank you. The blueprints for 100 acres of low-income, high-quality housing. And I call these are the homes that Mrs. Hamer built. So what are some of the lessons from Freedom Farms? One, I think we should challenge definitions of success. I had a student who asked me when she came to work with me, she said, can you really say that Freedom Farm was successful because they didn't do what they intended to do? As an academic, we often think in binaries. It either is successful or it isn't successful. Well, first of all, after I checked the student and said, well, I appreciate the question. I'm asking you to help me with my research instead of really assuming that it could not have been successful. And the argument that I make is that even if they weren't successful in terms of the overall vision of their work, they still offer us some valuable lessons that we go back and can unearth and use for our future work. And so I think it is in the interest of the same COFA that we look back to move forward. I think that Freedom Farm teaches us agriculture can be a form of resistance, especially when you live in a community where you're being starved and encouraged not to participate in the electoral process. I think Freedom Farm also tells us that community building can be resistance. Mutual aid is also resistance. And that there's an economic, political, and social benefit of establishing and participating in cooperatives. And so Freedom Farmers, as I titled the book, who are Freedom Farmers? I feel like this is an important point for us, as so much of the scholarship on Black people particularly centers on urban communities. I think it's important for us to recognize rurality, what we lose when we move away from the South and from those communities, and what we gain as we're returning to those spaces. I think it offers us a different lens to understand farmers as active, not passive. It also allows us to think differently about what was called the Southern Cooperative Movement. Very few people know that in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, that folks were starting these cooperatives in the South to make sure that everybody had what they needed. They had energy co-ops, they had agricultural co-ops, they had daycare co-ops, everything that someone needed, they provided. I think that it also allows us to look at how impoverished land workers have the potential to build a community with almost nothing. And it includes not just the work of land workers and not just those that are landowners. I think how we define farmers is often exclusive to those who own the land when they may not actually be the ones who provide the labor. And so I broaden that definition to the chagrin of USDA and say the folks who do the labor should also be included. I think that when we talk about what resilient communities are, it's an important opportunity for us to think about not just how do we access food. When you're thinking and asking questions about where your food comes from, it allows you to think, okay, this is interesting. What about the land that it's grown on? What are we using in terms of pesticides, herbicides, and other? It allows us to ask questions about education. Is this a liberatory education? Are we educating our children to be their whole, full selves? It allows us to think differently about employment opportunities and what that looks like. Safety and security, transportation justice, housing justice, and also including health care. So that's Mrs. Hamer and Freedom Farms. I'm always working on something. I've got a couple different projects that I'm working on right now. One is the new book that I'm working on is titled We Stayed, Agriculture and Activism of the Black Families Who Kept the Land. This is a book on 3 generations of the Paris family based in Tuskegee. The father was an early USDA loan officer. His 2 sons then went on to support the civil rights movement. And the argument that in the future generation, those are his children and others, talking about how activism has been central as we talk about agriculture and activism. The argument, the lesson that I learned from Reverend Paris was, first time I met him, he said, you can free yourself when you can feed yourself. When he said that, I had goosebumps. It was just sort of like that was my thesis statement all tied up and wrapped in a bow. You can free yourself when you can feed yourself. What else? I run the Office of Environmental Justice and Community Engagement at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it is under that umbrella that I'm able to work with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. I'm the founder of what we call Blackademics. And Blackademics is a community of Black scholars that make our services available to Black-led organizations, food justice organizations, and making sure that they have the intellectual skill, we give our intellectual skills for their goals. So we would do organizational histories, we will help with assessments, with grants and what have you. We also recently released a new journal called the Land, Food, and Freedom Journal that just came out. It's an inaugural edition in November, and it is a peer-reviewed journal that includes artists, activists, farmers, and young people, elders, and what have you. And with that, I say thank you. That shouldn't have been the last, this should be the last slide. This is how you reach me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. White, for those enlightening and inspiring words. On behalf of the Green Team, we would like to present you with this gift to show our appreciation. We hope that you wear this and remember being with us here today.
integrate more fresh food in the CAF. I'll ask you again, what seeds are you going to plant in that unit? I hope that you will join the green team and plant beauty, change, healing, and empowerment.
I just want to say that you also just have to know that you also have to partner with your team to do something like just picking up after yourself or recycling or just like being involved, like I don't know, like how in the CAF, like how we implemented like the sorry choosing the regular plate and things of that nature. Just remember that Bennett College is your home, so just take care of it and just try to take care of Bennett. And as we leave, just try to think more mindful and just show up to like the Bennett College groups events and just try to think, or after this event, how can I be better? How can I not throw away this clothes? How can I reuse it? What's more ways to be more sustainable, like reducing and not get rid of waste and things like that.
Bennett sisters, I challenge you to educate yourselves and become more aware of what's happening on this planet and within our community. The environmental movement isn't just recycling or a can or planting a tree. That's just the beginning. It's about believing that we're all connected and impact each other for good and for bad. Environmental justice is about building relationships in our community. It's about caring for others enough that we want everybody to be fed, everybody to be healthy and well, have clean air and water, be treated with dignity and respect and fairness, and the desires of a few for money and power don't outweigh the rights of the people. One of our dreams is to grow enough food in our garden that we can eat in the CAF and share with our neighbors here in the community in need. We want to start composting food and waste in the cafeteria, encourage everyone to just consume less things and focus more on things that matter, on relationships, helping and supporting others, and show love. We want Bennett to offer more classes that engage us and take us out into the community and ask us to work on the real problems, like access to real food, fresh food, the pollution, consumerism, renewable energy, and climate change. We have good ideas for how to help. So bells, we need you to keep our movement going. And we'd like to pass the torch to you. If there are any bells that would like to join the green team as well, feel free. Nevaeh Burley, our founding member, will now pass the torch to you all. And on behalf of the Green Team, we'd like to thank everyone for coming, and especially a thank you to Dr. Hayes. We love the Green Team so much. To everyone who participated, for all of the students, and everyone, a special thank you to Dr. Monica White. Thank you for making this day so transformative, and thank you, Bennett Bells, for joining us in person and on Zoom. And to everyone that's contributed to the Green Team's success and longevity of the Green Team, we'd like to thank NC Black Alliance and Brady Stafford. And Randall Romney, PFY, Community Gardener James Gardner, Aaliyah Collins at the Eco Healing Project, Dr. Shree Douglason at the City, Chef Sean at Ceiling Stone,